Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's really a great pleasure to have Carl Wyman here with us. I had the opportunity to first meet Carl around 6 weeks ago in Aspen when I was attending the Higher Education Forum. And amongst all the talks, and they had a lot of great people there, Carl's presentation and my conversation and meetings we had impressed me the most in terms of the depth of thought that has got, in some ways simple uses of technology that can really help transform science education. As the title itself says, both in terms of taking the scientific approach to the teaching of science. There's so much stuff out there that you don't feel you can really believe rather transformational, and bringing that scientific method to how we improve science education, although so simple as a concept that we should be applying, it is quite amazing to the extent that it doesn't get applied in the whole education field. So I said, we absolutely got to get Carl here, because he used to be professor at University of Colorado, won the Nobel Prize in 2001. Tremendous kind of skills from that, and he's joined UBC, so he's just a neighbor for us, where he is the director of now the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative, which is really saying how do we transform the teaching of science. The other, actually, there was a bio of Carl, sort of a note about himself, and the note they circulated at Aspen, which both impressed me, and I said, "Why, I'm so glad that Carl is looking at this topic." So what it says is, I'll read it. "My tendency to intensely pursue a particular activity to the exclusion of everything else was and is one of my most notable strengths and weaknesses. After retiring from chess, where he's just, I think, finishing his high school, my focus turned to tennis. That continued after I went to MIT, and I played intercollegiately in my freshman year, and from there he went to squash, and he was very good at the top of the freshman intercollegiate squash team. My squash career was notable in that I can claim to have lost to some of the best players in the country, including our future national champion. Unfortunately, my rather fierce competitive drive exceeded my limited physical capacities, and after surviving several minor injuries caused by throwing myself into walls and such, I hope he's doing some of that for the education side. Okay, by the end of my freshman year, I had seriously damaged my right elbow from excessive practice at squash and tennis. After several unsuccessful treatments, I then switched to playing left-handed, and by early in my second year of college was starting to again be competitive in both sports at the intercollegiate level. So you can see the dedication Carl brings to what he does. At that point, I developed serious elbow problems in my left arm, and reluctantly came to the conclusion that at age 19, it was time for my second retirement. It was only then I turned my full attention to physics, to go on to the Nobel Prize in physics. So, partly what I just wanted to say was it is, absolutely fantastic to have you here, and to have the focus that you bring to education, and science education in particular, because it is not only how we train the scientists, given the fundamental issues we have around environment, energy, everything else. I think it is important really that the whole population in some sense learns the basic principles of science, so we can make better decisions and of course have better scientists. Please welcome Carl.
Thank you. I have to say, they give you the Nobel Prize and they say, oh, we need this autobiography from you. And of course, you're kind of excited about getting the Nobel Prize, so you're cooperative and you write these things down. but you don't quite realize the time, how, this ends up on the web and follows you the rest of your life. I might have thought twice about what I said, but anyway, so yeah, I want to talk about science education. Now, one of the messages that I'll get across is the most important thing about education is actually worrying about who and why you're trying to educate. And so this puts me in an awkward position because I am, except for the three of you I've already met, I am clueless about what your background and interests in this whole area are. So I'm already going into this in a way that I know is completely flawed by the techniques I'll talk about. So, feel free to say, no, we're not interested in that, or gee, we'd like to hear more about this topic, because I'm just kind of winging it here. But as I say, I want to talk about kind of a different approach to thinking about science education. But before I do, I want to stress it also, I think, pretty clearly applies to other subjects, and I'll show you why I think that generalization is justified later on. But before I do, I think it is important to emphasize that getting a Nobel Prize in physics gives one absolutely no credibility. I mean, sadly, it often does give one credibility. It should not give anyone credibility to talk about education. But the reason you hopefully will pay attention to this is that everything I'm going to talk about today is really supported by lots of good data from many, many people. A little of my own. Who makes this software anyway? Yeah, that's going to come up every 5 minutes, right? Anyway, so I've actually had for going on 10 years now a pretty active science education research group of my own, which will provide a little bit of the data here, but most really comes, I'm talking about other people's work. So what I'm going to cover today is just, the sort of standard boilerplate about why science education is really important today. I don't think with this audience I need to say too much about that. But then talk about what research that's really come in predominantly over the last 20 years tells us about learning and tells us about the effectiveness of traditional approaches to teaching science and how we can do those better. And then I'll touch a little on some technology, by your standards, very simple technology, but it's clearly can be very powerful if used right. And then this is really what I'm spending a lot of my time these days on, institutional change, how to take what we know about improving science education and try and make it from little demonstration projects into a widespread scale. I'm not at all sure that this audience will be particularly interested in that, so I maybe just skip over that unless people ask me about it. Okay, so I think most of you are familiar with this, but it never hurts to be reminded that I think that science education, the need for it, has really changed pretty dramatically since World War II. And before that time, the historical purpose was really just producing the next generation of scientists, that little population of going to become engineers and scientists. But the other folks really didn't matter. Now there's two great big changes in society that have changed the needs here. And the one is just the issue of survival of the world. We're faced with these enormously important global scale issues like global warming, choice of energy sources, genetic modification, and so on. And if we're going to have a population that can make sensible, wise decisions on these really critical issues that are fundamentally technical at their heart, they've got to be a lot more technically literate than they are now. And the second one, I don't need to go on with this audience saying that the modern economy, science and technology are really awfully important, so pretty much independent of your occupation, you need to know some, and the economy will be better and you'll be better if pretty much everybody has some degree of scientific, technical understanding and the kind of complex problem-solving skills that can come along with that. But what these changes in society mean that the needs for science education now, we need to be thinking about making science education effective and relevant, not just for that little fraction who are going to be the next scientists, but really a large fraction of the whole population. And that's really a completely new and major challenge for science education. Now, one thing I'll point out that all the evidence says that if we do this, we actually will almost certainly create more and better scientists as well. So turns out that the research evidence is suggesting it's not an either-or situation. If we accomplish this, we'll just do the historical purposes better as well. So before I go into what we need to do this, it's important to define what we mean by an effective education. What do we want to achieve in education? What's the standard I'm going to use in evaluating how we're doing? And what I would argue is that it's really thinking about transforming how people think. So students come into our classrooms like this, and we want to have them go out transformed as a result of taking our science classes. Now, admittedly, most of them won't be quite that transformed, but the basic goal is to have them think about, no matter what they're going to be doing, what course it is, you want them to think about and use science more like a scientist. And that's the standard at which I'm going to evaluate. I'm going to look at how we're doing. Now, as I say, to do this for a large fraction of the population is an open question whether it's possible. Nobody has ever come close to this. But what I would argue, and lots of other people who've looked at this would argue, is that it is possible, but really one has to take a much more scientific approach to the teaching of science. And I, in particular, look at certain practices that are really at the heart of all experimental science and the heart of why it's been so successful. And see that those, I believe, and I'll try and demonstrate to you, can be applied to the teaching of science just as effectively. The first is just, the practices and knowledge based on good, rigorous data, like we do in science, not on tradition and anecdote and sometimes even superstition, like we do in education traditionally. Guide what you do by fundamental research. In this case, research about what we know about how people learn, disseminating results in a scholarly manner, and copying what works. So that, just like in science, I want to launch a new project, I go read the literature, I copy it, I'm already, at the state of the art, and then I can move from there. In science teaching, it's usually everybody reinvents it each time they go in to teach a new class. And then, finally, of course, utilizing technology effectively. And I think if we do this, and this is really necessary, it's moving the analogy I'd use is sort of moving from the bloodletting school of education to really the antibiotics. And this is actually, I think, I'm thinking in the medical analogy, it's a surprisingly accurate analogy. I mean, if you think back to, bloodletting was actually used for at least 1,000 years as an accepted effective medical treatment, and there was good evidence for it. A lot of the patients you treated with bloodletting, they went on, they recovered, they did fine. We have university education system. It's been working fine. We have scientists and engineers graduating, going on and being successful. So the level of evidence is really very similar. But I think we're now at the point in education where they got to in medicine 100 years or so ago, a little more, where we can set a new standard of rigor of what's real data to guide it, and we can look deeper understand the underlying principles. When you did that in medicine, you realized, hey, wait a minute, we can do a whole lot better treatments, much more effective treatments than bloodletting. And what I'm going to try and convince you is we're now at that stage in education, and there are the similar opportunities for really making a dramatic improvement. Okay, so that's sort of all the background. Now let me sort of jump in to try and justify these claims I've been making. And by starting out, look at what the research tells us about effectiveness of traditional science teaching. But before I get into the studies of that, I'm going to sort of give you an idea of how I came to be thinking about this, and so you can get a little understanding of my perspective. Now, when I first was called upon to teach 30 or so years ago, I was teaching sophomore electricity, I think, and I used the same basic approach to teaching that I think it's almost a kind of natural human response to teaching anything. You start out and you go off and you think really hard about the subject, and so you get it really clear in your own mind, have it all figured out. And so then you go and explain it to the students you want to teach it to, so they'll understand it with the same clarity you have. So, that's the idea. But, okay, so I didn't understand very much about teaching, but I've always believed very much in being experimentalist. I measure everything. And when I measured what my students were learning, I found that my brilliantly clear explanations left almost all of them really quite baffled. And so it was just no.
You're learning.
So when I push the wrong button, that talks over. And I actually would measure other faculty students, and they didn't seem to be learning much better than mine. So this was really a frustrating puzzle for me for many, many years as a college professor. But what got me to actually make sense of this was actually looking at my graduate students, because I had a big successful atomic physics program over many years, and that's the kind of research where you live or die on the success of your graduate students. So I worked very closely with them and worried a lot about their development. And I came to see a very consistent pattern. And it just showed up student after student, which was they would come to work in my lab, and they were physics graduate students. I was a pretty well-known professor. So by definition, they'd had 17 years of tremendous success in all their courses. But when I give them problems to work on, they were really clueless about really how to do physics at all. And so this was the first part, but then the thing that was really startling to me, really got me thinking, was they would come but just after a few years working in the research lab, they were expert physicists. Suddenly there was this enormous transformation that had taken place, which wasn't happening here at all. And after I'd seen this happen enough times, I decided, okay, this can't be just a funny, individual idiosyncrasy. There's got to be some basic underlying idea here. And so I really started thinking I've got to tackle this like a research problem and really make sense of this pattern. And so, one hypothesis that occurred to me, and it occurs to a lot of other professors I've talked to who have seen the same thing, is that maybe it's just the human brain has to go through a 17-year caterpillar stage before it can suddenly transform into a physicist butterfly. And that's not a crazy hypothesis, but I wanted to dig in a little deeper to see if it was true, and so I really started looking into what we knew about how people learned, particularly how people learned science. And from that, I came to the conclusion that this wasn't the explanation. This pattern actually made complete sense, and it also gave us some very clear ideas for how to improve the learning in our normal classrooms. And so I'm going to give you snippets of research that were behind this, my coming to think this way. And so I'm going to picked out very different kinds of data from looking at the effectiveness of traditional science teaching. And what I mean by traditional science teaching, I think is probably almost all of you have gone through it. The primary interaction between the instructor and the student is the instructor lecturing to a largely passive group, just like this. And then the students go home and do, homework problems from the back of the chapter in the textbook and have similar kinds of exams. So over the past couple of decades, people have really started to do careful research about just what students were and weren't learning from this, particularly at the college level. And so I'm going to talk about that. And I've picked intentionally 3 very different but quite general aspects of learning to look at. Retention of information from lecture, development of conceptual understanding, and then just general beliefs about physics and how it's learned, and you'll see exactly what I mean by that in a minute. And then I'm going to say a little bit, and I'll inject here various things from cognitive science, particularly about developing expert competence, that allows you to, it's kind of you can see a kind of foundational ideas behind this, and you can see why they're likely generalizable well beyond the particular data I'm going to look at. Now, I want to say, probably most of you aren't aware, but most of this data that I'm going to show you, or all the data I'm going to show you, comes from introductory college physics classes. And that's just because physics has kind of taken the lead in doing this sort of research. But a lot of other disciplines are now coming in, and we're quickly accumulating data from other sciences that all give a very similar picture to what I'm talking about here. There's also research from other levels, from the high school and middle school level, as well as even a bit from the graduate school level, that also quite consistent. So don't think this is particularly specialized. Okay, so let me start with retention of information from lecture. I mean, if you think about what a lecture really is, the traditional idea is it's transferring information from one person to a bunch of them. And it's actually not very hard to test how well that works. And so I'm going to give you examples of a few simple little tests that have looked at this. The first one comes from Joe Reddish, who's a physics professor at University of Maryland. And what's particularly notable about him is he was considered an extremely good lecturer, probably the best lecturer in the department. Students rated him very highly. But he started wondering how much his students were really learning, even though they said he was a great lecturer. And so he hired a graduate student to just catch the students as they left at the end of the class and interview them, asking them just, what was the lecture you heard about, what was it about? And what he found from this is that the students were consistently only able to give the vaguest of generalities of what they just heard. Now, a much more structured study was done at Kansas State, where they took 8 subjects. They gave them 6 specific questions to answer on the physics of sound, and they did as well as they could to answer these. They hadn't covered it in course yet. And then they were given a lecture on this subject. It was only 18 minutes long. It was a commercial videotape, very highly polished lecture by somebody who's supposed to be a wonderful lecturer, and told to get the answer to these 6 questions from that. So this is a very artificial situation, but everything that's artificial about compared to a normal classroom, you'd expect to really enhance the transfer of information and retention on those particular 6 questions. But in fact, what they discovered of these 18 students, 1 or less was actually able to get the answer from the lecture on the majority of those 6 questions. So then I've done some little studies with Kathy Perkins where we just, in our class, we were presenting some non-obvious fact with an illustration, and then 15 minutes later just testing students if they remembered it. And what we found was typically it was about 10% would actually get this right. So, you know, if one thinks about this, it's kind of shocking because, you know, there's thousands of science lectures going on every day all over the world. Can they possibly be, you know, you really have to ask, can this possibly be generic, that these are really meaningful? And I would argue that almost certainly they are generic, these results. And it comes from what's empirically the most well-established and widely ignored result from cognitive science, which is nicely represented by this Gary Larson cartoon. And it really refers to the fact that the short-term working memory, you know, the part of the brain that deals with remembering and processing information on short time scales, like an hour-long physics lecture, has extraordinarily limited capacity. The cognitive scientists will tell us from, you know, that from their research, it's the typical brain can remember about 7 items and process a maximum of about 4 ideas at once. Now, it gets kind of fuzzy to understand what that means. These mean going from the cognitive science lab to the physics class or biology class. But the one thing that is really clear is that this capacity is just a tiny capacity compared to the normal amount of material and thinking really called upon a student is called upon to learn. So in fact, those results showing a tiny retention of information are exactly what one would expect. It'd be astonishing to see anything different. Okay, so that's retention of information. And in keeping with this realization, I will make copies of the slides available because I know you don't have enough, unless you're fairly familiar with this topic, you don't have enough capacity in your short-term memory to get it all. Yes?
Roughly how long does it take, speaking in computer terms, to flush that data out of the short term into the long term and then kind of free that back up again?
It's not, so the flushing out is fairly easy to check. How long does it take to go away? It's roughly 20 minutes is what the studies I've seen. I don't know how, it's not clear to me exactly how much variation and so on, but that's kind of a time scale. The getting it into long-term memory, though, there's a bunch of things. It takes quite an extended period in coming back to it to shift it permanently into long-term memory, and I'll talk a little about what's involved in that. But it's kind of, you know, depending on how thorough and how deep you want to get it in there, it takes a great deal of time potentially. Was there another question? Okay. Okay, so, but, you know, information, one could quite reasonably argue, isn't that important anymore. It's easy to go look things up. What's much more important is understanding of basic concepts in discipline. And particularly because physics has these few basic concepts that are very widely applicable, there's been quite a lot of research on how well these are learned, particularly in introductory physics courses. And so there's out of this research, there's been some good tools, actually, for probing this in a sort of standard, rigorous way. And the most widely used, and probably the earliest of this, is something called the Force Concepts Inventory. Just again, for checking my audience, has anybody here heard of the Force Concepts Inventory before? Oh, okay, so a few of you have. So what this is it's a test that's quite carefully developed, and they take the basic concepts of force and motion covered in every first semester physics course, whether it's taught at your local community college or at Harvard University. And that's one thing that makes it easy to do the research, is it's so standard. So they all cover these concepts. So these people took these concepts, Hestenes, who developed this, and found simple and put a lot of time and effort into developing and validating a test to probe students' understanding, mastery of these, normally by having them apply the concepts in some simple real-world situation, like when a car runs into a truck, or on this one, this is one of the questions, this is a track sitting on a table and a ball rolling around inside it. When it leaves, what direction does it go out when it leaves the ball? And so this I think it's a 35-item test. And now the way it's used, and it's now used hundreds of courses every year, you give the test to the students at the start of the term, and you see how many questions they miss that they don't know those concepts. And then you give the same test to them at the end of the term, and you see what fraction of the questions they had right at the first place did they have wrong at the what fraction of the questions they had wrong at the beginning that they had right at the end. And you think this is kind of the learning gain that they've made over the course of the semester. That's just repeating myself. And what comes out is a very remarkable, very robust result. And what I'm showing here is for taking the average all the students in the class, you look at, okay, what was the average fraction of these concepts they didn't know that they actually learned? And if you look at many, many courses, and these are a histogram of the average learning gain for 16 different traditional courses, and what you see is that in a traditional lecture course, students never learn as much as 30% of these concepts they didn't already know at the beginning. And these are really the key concepts of this whole subject. And this data here and many other unpublished results I've seen that show the same thing, that it's really amazing because they cover very people of all different lecture or perceived lecture quality, different kinds of institutions, from community colleges to Harvard's on here actually. Big classes, small classes. It says, gee, this pedagogical approach simply is not successful at students to master conceptual understanding.
Is there a baseline study of what happens if you give the test twice with no lectures at all in between?
There's not that study, but I do know of a number. These people don't release their data to be published in places like this, but I do know of a few examples where the differences were negative, although within the random uncertainty. So it wasn't clear that they actually made a clear lack of learning, but they certainly made no gain at all. Yeah. I mean, you'd think that just giving a test twice would give some improvement, right? But I have to say that's not an accident. It's a very carefully, very well tested, the exam is such that it gets rid of a lot of these kind of factors. So like I say, this says that, gee, there's a fundamental problem with developing conceptual understanding with this approach to teaching science. But this also there's some shows hope for improvement, because using the same exam, then using some of the approaches that I'm going to talk about in a minute, people are now routinely getting 2 to 3 times improvement in this. And that's really what's striking. It's not that the old way was so ineffective, but that also new ways are so much more effective. This is having quite a major impact on the teaching of introductory physics. People are finding this data pretty compelling, and it's pushing a shift in a way that nothing in the previous 500 years did. So this has driven a lot of my thinking about how to improve education and institutionally. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to a completely different kind of data and a completely different kind of learning. It's really looking at just basic beliefs about physics and problem solving. And you can think about replace physics with any science discipline you want. One of the surprising results is that a student will have very different beliefs about physics than they will about chemistry. That's already unusual. But let me tell you what I mean by these beliefs. If you go out and interview a whole bunch of people, broad spectrum, you'll find you can classify their beliefs, say about physics, on a novice to expert scale. And what defines a novice end is they see the content of physics as just these isolated little pieces of information, and the way you learn physics is just memorizing all these little separate pieces. They see this information handed down by some arbitrary authority and quite disconnected to the world outside the classroom. And they see physics problem solving is just matching the patterns of what the problem you're given is with your memorized recipes that you have. Experts, okay, and so these are practicing physicists, will consistently tell you, the content of physics is this coherent structure of general concepts. These things are established by experiment. They describe nature. And, physics problem solving is creative use of these broad concepts, in widely applicable ways. And I want to emphasize that because from the point of view of useful learning, like something that, go out and do something for a company and so on, useful. This is, of course, useful, and this is completely useless for anything except passing the final exam, of course. The other thing I'll mention in passing here is that a lot of people are concerned about sort of the anti-science movement. And if you really think about how a person could have some of these anti-science beliefs, they have to have these kind of thoughts about science underlying that to make that possible. Okay, so if you realize people lie on this spectrum, you can, and this is one of the things my own research group has done, you can develop survey tools that actually will survey and characterize a person's beliefs. And again, we've been using this to first see what students initially think. So we measure their beliefs when they start a class here. And then, they come in here somewhere slightly over the novice level. And we want to see how much more expert-like do they become as a result of taking a physics course. Well, that's what we want to see. What we actually see is virtually every introductory physics course, except for a few experimental cases I'm going to talk about. And this has now been given, we've given a lot of courses at Colorado, and it's been used a lot of other places around the country. And there's other people who do similar work, see similar things. Students end up more novice-like in their beliefs at the end of having taken a course than they were when they started it. Now, we've more recently developed a version of this survey for chemistry, and we're seeing that, if anything, chemistry is even worse. And we're starting to work on biology and other subjects now. But this is sort of disturbing, obviously, but these beliefs are something that people really haven't looked at very much before, but we've been studying them quite a bit. And I'll just mention, I don't have time to go into any details, but we do have clear indications that these kind of beliefs are correlated with learning of the content. Not surprisingly, they're a powerful filter on the choice of what a student decides to major in, and even more profoundly, we say they're a very powerful indicator of whether they're going to be retained and be successful in that major years later. And it's important to emphasize these have nothing to do with ability or mastery of any kind of content. I mean, these are really much more like religious beliefs that they, based on what their next door neighbor said or their parents, gave them some basic beliefs about what science was, but it turns out this profoundly shapes what they end up doing. And so this is the point where I emphasize the issue about if we teach better, we can have better scientists, because what we're seeing right now is we're filtering on something very different from ability in terms of who ends up going into science. Okay, but we've been looking mostly at how teaching practices affect these. Not surprisingly, if your beliefs become more novice-like, you also see the subject as less interesting, and so that's important for motivation. But again, there's good news. Once you understand these things are important, we find it's very easy to actually avoid these declines. Now, I wish I could claim we knew how to make big improvements. We not there yet. We haven't tried that many things. But simply, we have seen now in several courses, all we do without changing anything other than explicitly addressing student beliefs. And so as you're presenting material, you always talk explicitly about why it's worth learning, how it connects up to the real world, and how it connects to things that the student already knows and makes sense. That is doing nothing more than that, is consistently gets rid of the declines, and in some cases we see small improvements. Okay, so I presented a bunch of data. I want to sort of now look at how you can understand this again at sort of a deeper level. Now, in particular, I've showed you how these courses being taught by experts in a subject, all built around concepts, or most students aren't learning the concepts from. They're learning less expert-like beliefs. And I think you can actually understand this pretty well by looking at cognitive science research on expert competence. And this is something that they've studied a lot of what makes up expert competence and how it's developed. And what they see is, okay, experts have a few basic components. They know a lot about their subject, hardly surprising. But in addition, experts have unique mental organizational structures for that knowledge that allows them to effectively retrieve and apply it. And they also have an ability to monitor their own thinking, test, is this a sensible way to be trying to solve this problem? Do I really understand this? How can I check those things? Okay, experts within their own disciplines can do this. Now, if you think about the traditional science teaching, implicit in that idea is really that if we just give the students the factual knowledge, then all the other expert-like way of thinking comes along for free. But in fact, the cognitive science says that's not right. That these things are really, these aspects in yellow, they're really new ways of thinking. They really require extended, focused effort to develop those capabilities, to construct that way of thinking. And that construction always is built on the person's prior thinking or understanding. Now, I would argue that this is actually basically biological in origin. You just can't get around it. And the reason I would make that claim is because if you think about anything we think about as mastery or expertise in a subject, that's all stuff that's built in long-term memory. That's all your expertise in a subject is contained in your long-term memory. And this gets back to the earlier question. To develop long-term memory, it's now well established that these are the aspects that go into it, and it's really a question of you got to build these little proteins and assemble them in the right structures in the brain to have that long-term memory, and this is what is sort of a requirement for making that happen. And so once you see this from general work on expert competence, you can also understand, okay, why we're getting those classroom results I was talking about before, because these simply weren't incorporated into that. And so it's just completely consistent. And that's why I'd argue it's so generalizable. And so finally I had the answer to this puzzle. It made sense because this traditional science teaching that they'd been going through and were so successful in for 17 years simply wasn't wasn't developing expert-like thinking. But if you look at what's required to develop this kind of expertise, expert-like thinking, I guess I didn't talk so much about this, but sort of a principle that emerges from all this research is that really people learn by creating their own understanding. And so effective teaching is really just the facilitating of people developing this understanding by getting them doing the things that cognitive scientists tell are necessary. Them deeply engaged in thinking about the subject on kind of the useful, productive, authentic problems, and then guiding them, or if you like, sort of coaching their thinking to become more expert-like. When you put it in those terms, then if you think about what happens in a research lab, when a student's working on their PhD, this is exactly what's happening all the time. And so it made me realize that, okay, it wasn't just the magic atmosphere of the research lab, or, being in the presence of laser light, like all my students were. It actually was just the cognitive processes that they were involved with there. But that tells you, I'm going to have to stop talking soon. But what it tells you is that this can tell you how to improve just the traditional all classroom instruction. You just have to get those cognitive processes embedded into what happens in the classroom. And so people are doing that. They'd been doing that before I figured it out. And so I just want to point out that it show you some data that it really does work. And in comparison with the data I showed you earlier, we've seen dramatic improvements in retention. So I mentioned earlier, it's now quite typical to see gains of vectors of 2 and 3 on this mastery of concepts. And I already mentioned we at least are getting small improvements in student beliefs. So I'm just going to quickly give you an overview of, okay, what sort of things are involved in getting those kind of results in this kind of research-based pedagogy. You have to know where students are thinking from and connect up to it. You've got to use the classroom because that's the main time you're going to have student-instructor interaction. You've got to have them really actively processing ideas rather than just passively getting information. And you've got to be guiding their thinking in that situation. And then, because long-term memory takes a whole lot more time to develop than they're going to be in the classroom, you've got to then send them off with good, authentic homework problems which have them reinforce this development of expert-like thinking, and you've got to give them useful feedback on those activities. And that's those are all sort of the essential elements. Okay, so, I've told you how you need to get them engaged and then guide their thinking in a classroom. That's one thing to do that with 1 or 2 students. It's quite another to do it with 100 or 200 students, like I've been teaching for the last 10 years. And so this is an area where I think technology, okay, so for this audience, I can be a little stronger. I have to be a little careful around professors. They get offended when I tell them that they can't do it without technology. I would claim that you simply can't, with 100 students, you just can't make this happen without technology, but you can make it happen with technology, and we have good demonstrations of that. And I'm going to show you 2 quite simple technologies that I've been involved with that accomplish this. The first is clickers. How many of you have heard of clickers or personal response systems? Oh, almost everybody. Okay, so maybe I don't even need to explain it. So every student has one of these things like this. You can to use them effectively, and that's emphasis is on effective, because there are many ways to use them ineffectively, I've discovered, as I go around and talk to people. Use them effectively. You'll periodically break up the class to give students questions like this, which are fairly difficult conceptual questions that they have to answer by pushing a button, and then the computer stores who they are and what their answer was, and then usually the computer knows that, and then the instructor and usually the whole class can then see what the distribution is. Now, I want to, this point is sort of more general, so I want to take a little more time on this. Like any technology, it's only as good as how you figure out how to use it. And so it's useful to reflect on what clickers actually do and don't do for you and why they can and can't be effective. I mean, they are an extremely simple technology, after all. And so the only thing they really give you is basic accountability. The student has to put in an answer that the instructor knows that student answered and what they answered. Okay, so there's a basic accountability. It's anonymous to their peers, which is important. Makes it very different from raising hands or things. And it gives the opportunity for a fast response. And so there's a lot of ways to not properly take advantage of this. But when it really is used properly, it can just dramatically enhance the communication and the engagement in a classroom, and therefore the learning. And I'll just tell you some of the things we've found, because this is something now with my initiatives we're kind of studying, okay, what makes this really work well or not so well. You've got to have class built around really a regular set of quite challenging questions, not trivial stuff, really challenging questions that have them really thinking about the concepts. Having them talk to each other is a really important step. So we go so far as to actually have them assembled in little assigned groups. So you 3 always have to sit together, and on many of the questions we'll say, okay, you've got to argue amongst yourself and come to a consensus before you put in your answer. And that we're going to check that you answered the same, although I've never done that yet, but I tell them that. So that information, that peer interaction is really valuable. And then you have to have suitable follow-up discussion. And that can be done much more effectively through this technique, first because you see the histogram of how many people got answers, but also the other real value of this student-student discussion is, as an instructor, I can wander around and listen in on you and find out how you completely misunderstood the question because I said something that, used some term that you misunderstood, and therefore you're, thinking about this totally wrong. And I can then directly address those kind of confusions, and that's really what makes it much more effective. Yeah.
What's the
The only benefit of, like I say, we never actually check, and they often don't, but the benefit of that is students are not used to talking to each other in class and, well, about intellectual activities. And in particular, they're not used to having a scientific discourse. I mean, if that sounds kind of formal, but really to talk about these ideas in a scientific way. And so, I mean, we've done tests, and it's really clear. We say, okay, talk to your neighbors and try and figure out the answer, you know, and you hear this level of noise. You say, okay, on this question, I'm going to require you to come to a consensus, okay? And the noise level goes up by a factor of 2 or 3 because suddenly, okay, I've got to talk to him. And so that's why it's important.
I would think that trying to explain would also make you think in a more systematic way than just, you know, because I have to convince you of something else. I got to have my reasoning straight.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The talking to each other in general has a whole bunch of values to it. The reason we say you have to come to a consensus is just to make sure they will talk to each other. Yeah, there's all kinds of abilities that come about, and feedback, and you thinking about it at a deeper level and developing these abilities to test arguments that just don't happen otherwise. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's an extremely important part of science education, and we see that a lot of students actually benefit more from practical and that. Was there anything in your study that kind of differentiated the retention or the amount of learning that happens from a discussion versus a practical?
So the research on that depends very much if you're going to look at, are they doing independent research, you know, independent undergraduate research in which you can measure all these benefits, versus are they going through a standard teaching lab in which all the evidence says it's virtually impossible to tell if they've gone through such a lab other than looking at a transcript, that students take away nothing from those. Now, you know, you'd ask, well, how can that be because of what you're thinking about? The reason that happens is not what labs could be, but what they are, okay? There's an enormous difference in perception between the student's perception of what a lab is for and what they should be doing in it versus what the instructor's perception of what it's all about, okay? And so it's because of that, the student's idea of a lab is, I'm supposed to get this number that they, you know, that they want me to get. And that's the whole purpose of this exercise. And, you know, that's just the reality of way labs work. And so the research on them is pretty not, well, it just tells us they're doing a rotten job. It's a tremendous waste of time and money. It's not saying they couldn't be highly effective. I think our experiences with the research lab tell they can be highly effective. It's just you're not building the right cognitive processes into those labs for them to be effective. Okay, so I'll just finish with the nice toys. These interactive simulations, my group been developing a lot of these. So these things, by your standards, are incredibly crude and you know, simple. By the standards of what's mostly being created out there for educational simulations, they're incredibly sophisticated and carefully developed. So that's just telling you the state of affairs. We've developed a lot of the now, and they basically range from very simple things like the balloon and sweater up to now we have a whole suite of things on quantum mechanics and quite an accurate, if you really want to know how a laser works, go in and play with our laser simulation. It's quite an accurate model of it. What's happening here? Okay. So I'm just going to give you a few quick examples of how these work. So these are all web-based. They just run through regular browsers. Most of them are in Java. A few of them are in Flash. And so like on this one, you can grab it and rub it on the sweater. And you pick up the electric charges, and now you get the forces because the imbalances in charges, and you get more, and there's a bigger force. You can take it over to the wall and see what's happening to the electric charges in the wall, and from that understand why it sticks to the wall, but only if it's really close, and then otherwise it gets pulled back. So this is quite a simple one. Let me go to one that's, this one was designed to address a very specific educational challenge, which is that students have a great deal of trouble actually understanding what graphs really are, particularly graphs of motion that we use in physics a lot. And so this guy is just showing how technology can really help that, because you grab this little fellow and then you drag him around here, and it makes a graph in real time of the velocity and the acceleration and the position, and you can either play back this one or play back other graphs that you've created, and it shows the motion that follows this. So this is just an example of how technology can do something which is, I mean, to put this in more technical terms, there's an expert-like way of thinking, connecting multiple representations of information that experts do. It's hard to learn. This is an example where technology really enables that to happen much better than any other learning format you've got. So, okay, so then I'll just finish with, this is our bestseller. Well, using the term loosely, since we give away, these are all free on the web here, so people just download them and use them. But, so on this, you close the switch and the light bulb lights up and the electrons move around. And if I increase the voltage, the electrons move faster, light bulb gets brighter. We've got other tools here like meters that allow you to measure the voltage at different places around the circuit, and all sorts of different things you can do with it. And again, this one takes what we knew from research to be a very difficult concept for students, namely having really a good model of what an electric current flow was. And there are several erroneous models that people sort of spontaneously have. This, through what we display here and through what we allow students to manipulate, goes directly to addressing those, their student thinking in very carefully designed ways to guide what they see, what they can change. And we've got good data showing this is highly effective at having them learn about basic electricity and basic voltage and current flow. And in fact, to get back to your question, we actually have a comparison of playing with this, doing this versus the same set of activities with a real hands-on lab. And the data says that the students who worked with this for 2 hours in the middle of a semester compared to 2 hours on the regular lab, on all the questions involving electricity on the final exam, the students who worked with simulation did higher. And on a test of building a real circuit with real components, they did it better too. So it was pretty good evidence. Yes?
Would you display these in a lecture, in the course of a lecture, or would it be all
So we've made them to be as flexible as possible. So people use them in lecture. They're a whole lot better than standing up and talking about this to see things happen, particularly because if you're using them effectively, you have clicker questions that make people predict what's going to happen if you change different parameters and so on. So they're used in lecture, but then we also have them do laboratory or pre-laboratory activities. So they're either in place of or incorporated with labs, and then also used as part of homework assignments as well. So because they're, that's the great beauty of things that are web-based. They can be all things to all people sometimes. So.
You have one for AC circuits, capacitors?
Yes. Yeah, I was just showing the DC. There's an AC version that's got more stuff in it. No transistors yet. That's a challenge. But
you have one for moment of inertia?
We are working on that. Moment of inertia isn't a very useful idea for most things, so I haven't been so big on trying to teach it.
It was just tough. I remember my physics.
It was hard to understand. Right. Right. No.
The Olympic skater is the one thing you can...
Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, I was thinking of three-dimensional moment of inertia tensors, which people have been talking to me about lately. No, basic moment of inertia, yes, that one, I don't know if it's released yet. There's a beta version of it.
Do you have some sort of toolkit for building these simulations where you reuse parts, or do you do them all from scratch?
What we have is, we've got a team of 3 software engineers that make these, and they have now a rather elaborate Java toolkit. I don't know enough about the technical stuff to understand this, but my understanding is, they've got this extensive toolkit now that greatly facilitates the construction. Everything we do is open source, so yeah. It's on SourceForge. They put all this stuff out there. So.
Construction is a concept understanding with the application of construction, anything in terms of that cycle, other things required before they get started in construction?
Sorry,
In other words, if you don't have the basic knowledge, you probably aren't going to learn much from the construction. So how did you learn about giving them the knowledge, working on it? Do you give them more knowledge and continue to work on it, or is this a sequential thing where you all this instruction and all this application?
Oh, right. What's very well established is it has to be integrated. Okay. Yes, and you just keep building up. Knowledge without a context of how it's applied, people don't have any idea how to apply it. That's another fundamental flaw in a lot of the instruction. You think, well, you give them these basic tools, then we'll teach them how to apply it. Doesn't work that way. People only learn things in a meaningful way if they've got if they see how it's being used.
I would imagine to a university administrator this could be quite powerful because you could essentially establish a baseline of knowledge and then demonstrate improvement over the baseline during the semester.
Yes, but you do have to first have those tools for establishing that baseline of knowledge. So that's one of the big things that my initiatives are doing, is supporting people to create those kind of baseline instruments on essentially a course-by-course basis, because it's on the order of 6 months of a postdoc's time to do that. They've got to establish what the goals are that the faculty want, and then they've got to really study how students are thinking about the subject and to create an assessment instrument like the Force Concepts Inventory or like our belief survey. But yeah, that is one of the powerful things. And from my point of view, just jumping ahead to my institutional touching on the institutional change, is I think this is the only hope for driving improvement in a monotonic fashion, as opposed to the wild fluctuations of one thing or another. Yeah.
What are the factors? It sounds like you're driving this institutional change. What are the main reasons why institutions are not changing it? What are the limitations to adopting all of this?
So the biggest limitation is well, you sort of this is a sociology question, but you've got a tradition of you've got a system of a very long tradition. Literally medieval. That's the traditions and many of the practices. Okay, So you've got this long tradition. People don't like to change traditions. You've also got the people who need to change are the ones who were who succeeded in coming through that system. Okay, so it's very much the case of if you went back to doctors, okay, and you said, okay, you can't be a doctor unless you were treated with bloodletting from some serious disease and you recovered, okay, and now you're going to go convince those people that, gee, bloodletting's really not a good treatment, okay? So, I think it's sort of that actual aspect. But then beyond that, you've got to worry about the incentive system. Right now, there is no connection between student learning and support anywhere in the education system, but certainly in higher education. And in most cases, there's no way to measure. I mean, you couldn't even talk about doing that because we can't measure the student learning until we get these kind of meaningful assessment tools. So, yeah.
Have you seen and do you have an opinion on the classroom presenter tools at the University of Washington are using? We had some involved.
Let's see. My trouble is I've seen so many things. I know I've seen Classroom Presenter. I'm trying to remember which one it is in terms of it. Is it this?
Back PowerPoint slides, essentially.
What?
So you can draw on PowerPoint.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Or ubiquitous. Yeah. Yes. Right. So those. I mean, a lot of these things are in the category of, okay, they're technology, and depending whether it's good or not depends entirely on how it's used. Some of these presenter kind of things clearly are violating the cognitive load rule. I mean, within cognitive load, I mean, what the studies show is not just that there's a maximum capacity, but it says that any additional processing, it's called undue, takes away from what you'd like them to be doing. Like it's really similar to your PC with not enough memory in it. You try and run PowerPoint and other things at the same time, and things blocked. So many of these tools, people put in all these bells and whistles, which actually add cognitive load to nothing else than to watching all these other things happen. Those are almost certainly detrimental. But that's not a blanket statement because you can strip things away and use them right. But that's yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that the information transfer from lectures, it didn't seem to matter the quality of the instructor or the university didn't seem to matter. I wonder if the same is true in the lecture. Yeah. Format. I wonder if the same is true for the beliefs, for the. And I just asked that because my sense was we would have.
Right. Yeah.
Clearly, it wasn't as clear as we thought because
Yeah.
it's still a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did come out with was this sense that there was this structure and that there was so.
Yeah.
So this is maybe before we completely get rid of lectures.
So, I mean, it's also exactly what you're doing with lectures. So there's two parts to that question, really. Okay, I didn't exactly say that lectures don't matter. I showed that the best lectures in the world don't get above 30%, okay?
On information transfer.
Oh, well, on that conceptual understanding. So let's just take conceptual understanding, because not such good lectures, they can be down at 5%. So there is actually an effect, but it's not very much. The beliefs about science, there you really have to get into how you define a good lecture, because we know some people are considered good lectures because they actually do address student beliefs. They talk to the students about, see how you can understand how your iPod works, because of these concepts, and that students think is a really good lecture. They're bringing in all these things, they're showing how it connects. So that clearly makes a difference. But the aspects of, but the reason that it's so widespread is these of this negative impact is there's so many elements in the basic instruction, which is, if you think about physics, it's so ingrained that you teach these basic concepts as abstract ideas, and then sometime later on you talk about how they're useful for something. Students have that didn't mean anything if they didn't see that when they were first introduced that they were useful. You look at the homework problems they're given, frictionless blocks on inclined planes, and what's the electric field from this distribution of charges. All of those things are telling them that's what physics is, this is what physicists do. You look at their exam problems, which almost always can be done simply by, okay, I know the right formula there, right here, given a bunch of numbers here, calculate this, okay, so I go find the right formula, plug those numbers in, get the answer. So there's all of these things, even with a great lecture, there's all these components. Some Reddish calls this the hidden curriculum that's built in and very pervasive. So I agree with you on the one hand, but it's not enough. Yeah.
Can you come into any information on depth versus breadth in terms of what you teach in your classes?
Yeah, there's a lot of studies on that. That if you want people to understand, real mastery of something, developing like those mental organizational structures, being, all of these expert-like thinking skills, that's all requires depth. And so what we know over and over and over again is depth is much more important than breadth.
And yet, given that in secondary education right now, there's tremendous pressure on breadth.
It's true across the entire education system, but I would argue that a lot of that goes back to people's basic beliefs about science, and because we are busy sending out of our classrooms folks who think that learning science is memorizing facts, and so the more facts you've memorized over more things, the better your learning of science is. So that's fundamental flaw, and that's why I'm arguing we've got to deal with this at the university level before we've got to give people a different model of what science is and how it's learned before we can expect to fix things at the level which ultimately, have the biggest impact. Okay, so I think I'm done here, so I'll just covered everything important and probably got the questions. I'll just say, so one of the things that, comparison to earlier, one of the radical things we do with our simulations compared to other people who developed it is we always make sure we test them with at least 6 students before we release them. We actually, out of this, of learning quite a lot about how students think and learn. It turns out, and I want to throw this out to this audience that deals with technology and IT, in that, because I am involved with studies of science learning of a whole variety of different ways and different assessment tools. And what I see is out of the simulation testing, we get emerge much more quickly and directly results that come from other very different contexts and much harder to extract, really. And one of them is, the first is that this idea that student brains are really different than expert brains. They're not just uninformed. And we see this on the simulation where students will literally perceive different things happening on the screen than experts will. And you'll see this very clearly tied to how they're organizing and perceiving information. And we can see the stages at which they change, all very much clearer and more directly than has come out of other research on these things. we also see this idea that understanding is really created or discovered or constructed, if you, as the term often used. I mean, we see it in that if you make things that have simulations with lots of fancy animations, people are that really grabs their attention, but they don't actually learn very much from those things, if anything. It's when they're actually directly interacting and asking questions. And, you know, in the video games, people are the challenging ones where people really develop mastery. They're thinking about solving problems, right? And they're doing things to solve those problems. They're getting feedback from them. And we see that is exactly happening with all these simulations, you know, and we keep iterating them on until they achieve that. But again, that's, you know, that's exactly what you folks know, but it's a pretty revolutionary idea in a lot of education, that's what really counts, is this, is that they got to be actively figuring things out. It's not enough just watch. Okay, so I think we've covered almost everything else on the institutional change, so I'll just stop. There's been lots of questions already, but happy to answer more. Anything left?